here, and in order to get elected, but it was such a terrible lie, or myth, I should say. I'm going to begin the questioning process. Sister Sheryll, remember when we were emailing back and forth, and after I had begun to read your book, I read your prologue, and I was just blown away by how long the systematic hatred has been made publicly stated and espoused. I ask you why and how could you take all of that horrific and abusive tales about us as a people? And then I ask, what can a person begin to do with all of the information you are sharing? And what did you tell me was your calling? That is being a truth teller. Would you explain that a little bit more?
Thank you for that question, Sister Johnny. Well, I'm a child of civil rights. I'm not sure which camera I'm supposed to look at. I'm a child of civil rights agitators in Alabama, and my emotional inheritance was that I was supposed to spend my waking hours agitating for Black Americans who have a lot less than me. And I'm not in the streets, I'm an academic, and so I do it through words and I do it through speaking. And I was finishing this book during the pandemic, listening to your sermons, you know, in my pajamas. And more it came to me that, you know, it's my obligation to tell the truth. And that's my primary goal. You can't understand, in my view, persistent anti-Black inequality in this country without understanding the role of geography and the system that is of caste. And so I'm telling my truth here. Each time this country has seemed to have put to bed a peculiar Black subordinating institution, it has created another one. So I'm telling the story from slavery to Jim Crow to the iconic Black ghetto. I'm trying to shine a light on the 21st century system of caste that oppresses Black people and helping people to understand the continuum.
Thank you, Deacon Love. And did you have another question you wanted to? Well, okay. Thank you for your introduction and for setting us up. I'm interested, Sister Cashin. This is a remarkable book, and I'm delighted to be joined by Sister Rukia Flack-Bonner, who is also co-facilitating. And we can just kind of jump in. We'll jump in and ask questions, and we'll open it up to those who are here, as well as those who are streaming the book club this afternoon. But as you wrote this book, I can certainly tell that this is, you come not just with a tremendous academic experience as a great scholar, but also one who's deeply troubled by the suffering and pain that you're currently seeing our people experience in our community today. I was struck by just how clear and lucid your writing is in the text, how well you tell stories, and in particular, you spotlighted really the kind of concentration of poverty among poor Blacks in the kind of inner city, but also poor whites, in the suburbs, and how in some way political figures continue to kind of stoke this division between both groups and not really helping the groups to understand their kind of mutual struggle, in a sense. In your book, you also give examples of places that are trying to kind of transform the relationship between these poor Black communities and also poor white communities who are doing this work of, I love this phrase of kind of abolition and repair work. And you highlight the work in Richmond, Virginia, with Devon Bogan's anti-violence work, and Lukia Barnett in the Powerhouse. Can you kind of provide, first of all, kind of update on, I'm just curious to know how they're doing in the work that you kind of highlighted in your book since you wrote the book, provide any updates that you may have of those and others, because I love the stories you tell, and also some other examples of abolition and repair work that you've seen.
Okay, so before we dive in, I forgot to just say thank you. Thank you to you, my church family, for sponsoring this event. I'm very moved. You know, I was baptized right there.
Wow.
20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, by Pastor Harkins, and this church has been such a blessing to me. I feel like I'm still growing in my relationship to Christ. I think you can see my relationship to Christ reflected particularly in the chapter about abolition and repair. You know, this Black liberation theology has very much animated my work. So let's talk about it. First of all, I call the people trapped in the hood descendants as a honorific, a term of affection, really, to take an acknowledgement of the direct continuum from slavery to Jim Crow to the hood, right? The iconic ghetto was created to contain the 6 million plus Black people, the great migrants who left the South to escape Jim Crow everywhere they landed in this country. Public policy beginning in the early 20th century contained them, redlined their neighborhoods, cut them off from investment, and then subjected those neighborhoods to cumulative plunder, right? Negro removal, interstate highways that mowed right through the vital parts of Black communities, right? Mass incarceration, militant policing, right? And so I take it straight through. So I don't want to skip over all of that to understand what it is the abolition and repair work needs to be. I say that we have a system of residential caste animated by 3 anti-Black processes: boundary maintenance, keeping these segregated lines, we invest in it, the government does, opportunity hoarding, which we can talk about, over-investing in whiteness, disinvesting Blackness, and stereotype-driven surveillance. So when it comes to abolition and repair, my argument is we need to reverse those processes. And I hold up examples of descendants. Black people have never laid down in the face of oppression. You know, for 400 years, I celebrate people like Devon Boggin and Lakia Barnett. Each chapter opens with a descendant, you know, a story of a descendant. It's a story of our resilience, our resistance. So I'll talk just about Devon Boggin in response to your question. I start the chapter on abolition and repair with his story to show what abolition and transformation looks like. Right? He was in Richmond, California, which had some of the highest rates of gun violence in the country, higher than Baltimore, higher than Chicago, right? And he looked at the 24 odd young, mainly Black, but Black and Latino kids who were inclined to pull the trigger as 3-dimensional human beings capable of transformation, right? And instead of saying we should just lock them all up, he said, you know, let's wrap them in love. And he came up with this idea of giving a Peacemaker Fellowship to these young men, 18-month Peacemaker Fellowship, said, you know, we're gonna give you a chance. These were kids who were not yet prosecuted for anything, to change your life. What do you need? You need a GED, you need a driver's license, you need training, a job, cognitive behavioral therapy, drug therapy. What do you need to transform your life? And virtually every young kid, and they gave them a 24/7 mentor, basically gave them what affluent parents give their children: unconditional love and trying to eliminate barriers. And gun violence dropped by 55% for about a program that cost about $1 million to start, right? Meanwhile, in Chicago, the city spends about $1 million every 4 years to incarcerate people for every inner city block. $851 million every 4 years. So there's an example where if you change the lens by which you see black people, from presumed thug to presumed citizen, from deficit to asset, it frees you up to focus on evidence-based strategies that can lift people up and actually are more effective. So that's what abolition and repair is about.
To Richmond, California, are there other examples too that you can point to around the country?
Yes, I have a litany of them. Okay, so the professor in me is going to keep it within. Okay, so we have to reverse boundary maintenance, we have to reverse opportunity hoarding, and we have to reverse surveillance, right?
Yes.
So the Devon Boggin one is reversing surveillance.
Right.
But opportunity hoarding. There are 3 cities, Baltimore, Minneapolis, and Seattle today, which have a racial equity analysis required in their budgeting. Baltimore is a largely black-run city. They have like 7 or 8 black mayors in a row, majority black representation on the city council. They, when they did the analysis, found out to their own horror that they were spending 4 times as much in white neighborhoods as black neighborhoods with their community development dollars. But now they have to have racial equity in their budgeting where they pay attention to where the money's going and disrupt that and start prioritizing historically defunded neighborhoods, right? So that's a movement that's starting, and you hear that word, racial equity. I lift up the descendants of Milwaukee in the chapter. There's a grassroots organization called Liberate MKE, but basically what they do is a citizens budgeting process in the black neighborhoods, going out and asking people, what do you want to make your neighborhood better? And coming up with their own priorities, right? And they're not shocking, affordable housing, more youth development, and something better than militarized policing to deal with gun violence, right? And that Liberate MKE movement succeeded in getting a substantial reallocation of the police budget to the programs that they wanted, right? The city had been spending half of their revenues on policing. So there's an example.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just wanted to go back to love, this notion of love. You spoke about it when Reverend Roberts first asked you about the book. You quoted your undergraduate advisor or professor that said, "Love is our wealth," and you included a quote from Bell Hooks about love in your book.
Right.
So I wanted to know what your stance is. And in this church, in our sanctuary, I immediately think about neighborhoods and love thy neighbor. I'd love to get your thoughts, no pun intended, about love and the role of love and equity.
Right. So I'm going to repeat this for the audience in case they couldn't hear it. Just like the last few sentences of the book, I quote an alumnus from my undergraduate. I went to Vanderbilt, but we were having a meeting of the black alumni, and he said to us, he was an elder who said, "Love is our wealth." And that phrase just struck me because it's so true, right? Black community, a lot of our wealth has been savaged, but we have love, and the number one love is self-love, right? But I talk about, with abolition and repair, I cite the work of a lot of black intellectuals and writers, including Bell Hooks, right? And I was very influenced by her essay, which basically, it was heavily aimed toward a white audience to talk about how any movement for transformation in this country, if it's going to ultimately be sustainable, absolutely has to be animated by this principle of agape love. It's, you know, it's right back to Dr. King, right? The beloved community, agape love. And she's pointing out that all of this white supremacy and all of the institutions it has fostered, right? And this terrible, toxic country where we have division, right? We have a society that right now that's premised on violence, right? You know, violence and menace. If I can't get my way, I may kill you, right? That's not a sustainable, and so it's, my argument is the first step we need for abolition and repair is to change the lens by which we see descendants, right? From presumed thug to presumed citizen. And once you do that, that's really 90% of the work. Once you do that, when people actually, you know, bring that lens, then they're free to join the coalition. They're free of fear. They're free of the supremacy. And Bell Hooks was talking about how entering a multiracial coalition for reconstruction, revolution, whatever you want to call it, right? The first thing you need to do is bring that lens, right? And she's really speaking to what the white person, even the affluent white person, what do they gain from entering in this? First of all, they gain freedom from this toxic idea of supremacy, which a lot of people carry in their heads. I mean, they may not be straight up racist, but they're so used to being dominant in any discussion, right? But if you come from a premise of agape love and inclusion and openness to difference, then you may come to the PTA meeting with a different attitude, like, okay, I don't necessarily, I'm not get my way in everything, right? I'm one voice among many. So thank you for that question. I hope it makes clear what I'm talking about. And I'll say very quickly, I thought when I was writing this in 2020 that the first step was the hardest step. But I was very heartened by the 20 million people who were participating in the summer of 2020 in 2,500 protests around this country, raising up signs saying that Black Lives Matter. I think Black people have a lot more allies than they may think they do.
That's right. We want to remind those who are online that you can also submit your questions. So if there are questions that you have online, please submit those, and we're looking at those in our chat room. Thank you. So I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I was thinking also about how you share how the pandemic has helped to exploit and in many ways exacerbate a lot of the societal issues and problems, these tensions and oppression that were already present in our nation. And can you elaborate? I love this concept on the concept of kind of a virtuous cycle for national healing and what that would look like in our most vulnerable communities.
Okay, so what we have now, or we've had for 8 decades, is government investing in policies that make life worse for descendants, particularly mass incarceration, right? If you think about how much money government spends to incarcerate non-violent drug users, right? You're tearing away parents from a community, people who could be an asset if they just got some drug treatment and were treated like a human being, right? And, you know, their ability to reintegrate into society is made much worse, and they're marked, and it's, you know, so we're spending an ungodly amount of money to make things worse. So that's a downward spiral, right? Whereas, I'll go back to the Peacemaker Fellowship, okay? For a fraction of the cost, they give these fellowships to 24 or so young men, the people who were most likely to pull the trigger. And Devon Boggins said he realized they were potentially the most powerful change agents He went to exactly where the problem was, right? And redeemed them. 24 guys, but they're changing their behavior, influenced all of the young people around them, right? That's a virtuous cycle, right? So they're changing their behavior, and then they are getting engaged in and beginning to see themselves as change agents, like, and feel validated. You know, they gave them for 9 months $1,000 a month if they left their, if they met their life map. They were meeting all their goals for changing their lives, and they started to see themselves as, you know, invested in community change. So it was an upward cycle, right? And that city, there's been in the news a lot about the spike in gun violence, but there was recently an article about Black communities, and in a number of Black communities in 2020, gun violence did not go up.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
Which suggests that there's something different going on in those particular Black-run communities. Not all of them, but a lot of them had begun to invest in this more humane approach to gun safety, you know. So there's a sharp difference between a virtuous cycle of repair versus doubling down on policies that are animated by fear and stereotyping. Like, these people are a threat. They need to be held apart from society. They need to be contained, either in their own hoods or in jail.
Thank you. Thank you.
And in breaking down these stereotypes, it seems that the world or our nation has done a little bit of a better job since the George Floyd tragedy in understanding. It's something that we've, of course, all understood forever, but that representation matters. So many media companies are pouring money into campaigns showing different segments of Black life to normalize it or to make everyone a citizen. What do you think about, do you think it's getting any better, or do you think we're moving in a positive direction in connection with making all of us appear as citizens to the police or to the forces that try to police us differently?
So you're asking about the visual representations and the
About
cultural
lens.
representations?
In connection with change in the lens, the media's role in that.
Right.
I think it's getting better, and I just wanted to hear what you thought.
I agree with you. I think there are things to be hopeful about. There are also things that are very depressing, but let me lead with the hopeful, right? There's so much Black content now, I can't even keep up with it. You know, from books. I mean, I've been in this game a long time. This is my 5th book, right? And I remember my first and second book, my first and second tip, I had an agent at a fancy agency in New York who said, race books don't sell. No, you know, nobody's interested in race, but now, you know, I'm competing with all these race books that are selling really, really well, you know. So there's been a plethora of content, you know, there's been a plethora, you know, images. I don't know, you know, I wonder if we're having a renaissance, like the Harlem Renaissance, where Black culture was very popular and then all of a sudden it was gone. You know, I don't know how sustainable this is, but I do think that for any open-minded person who wants to engage with and understand Blackness and particularly the Black American walk and experience, there's a plethora of ways for them through entertainment or reading to do that. And then we have CRT. You know, here's the dark side, right? So we had this brief moment of reckoning after George Floyd.
That's
I mean, you know, where it really felt like this country was really trying to reckon with how did we get here to where some person felt it was okay to lean on this man's neck and kill him for all to see. And people were begging him, just get up off his neck, please. People were begging him, and he wouldn't move, right? And people were horrified. How did we get here? And every institution in America was reckoning with this. And, you know, a lot of black people got work. You know, I got more speaking engagements from corporations than I ever had in my life, right? And the backlash was almost immediate, you know, and Trump was was leading it, right? He started running on stoking fear of the protests, casting the protests, which were overwhelmingly nonviolent, casting them as violent, Antifa, subversive, you know, and now, I mean, we're at a point where a beautiful book, I think it's called Brown Girl Dreaming. I think it's called, just a beautiful memoir of a coming of age story by Jacqueline Woodson. Some places are trying to ban it, you know, among a lot of other titles, right? Beloved. You know, God forbid a high school student should be forced to read the work of a Nobel laureate.
Right.
And reckon with so we've got the forces of darkness. I'm laughing to keep from crying, right? We've got the forces of darkness. This is what the prologue was about, Sister Johnny, right? From Thomas Jefferson to Donald Trump, I have a chapter in the book about anti-black mythology and how it's been used from the beginning. For most of the second half of the 20th century, it was central to the divide and conquer. What people who want to hold on to dominance have most feared in this country is that black and non-black struggling people would get together to demand something of elites. And the main rhetoric to divide them has been, you know, this coded stuff about black people and CRT and, you know, trying to scare people about having children learn the truth about history is now part of that rhetoric. So I'm encouraged, but also frankly discouraged. You know, I was very discouraged by the Virginia election and how that was used and how well it seemed to work.
As you share, I'm also thinking about what would kind of motivate. So you talk about the civil rights movement and how the appeals to agape love, kind of the moral conscience of the nation, kind of mobilize people to act. But you also note that in response to that, there was a white backlash. We saw what has happened, as you shared, with the election of the first black president, Obama. There was the sense that the nation was healing itself, repairing itself, and then we have this tremendous white backlash with the election of Donald Trump. And Bell Hooks talks about that, and you shared earlier, this sense that what should motivate white people or people in power with wealth to want to do good for all people, to begin to see all people, not particularly blacks, as citizens, not as thugs, is the sense that they will be kind of liberated from this terror of white supremacy. That doesn't seem to be enough to motivate and inspire people to want to transform how they look at others and even want to share this opportunity that they're hoarding. What else do you think, as I'm thinking about your work, what is that something else that we need to appeal to help people who have power and privilege want to begin to think about others differently?
Okay, well, I talk about this in the final chapter. I'm more about the business of encouraging reachable whites and people of color to mobilize their power in elective politics to win elections, right? You don't have to convince everybody. But, you know, I'm of the Frederick Douglass school. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did. It never will. I'm the agitator's daughter. Frederick Douglass was my father's hero, became my hero. So what makes me hopeful is that with each passing generation, it gets easier, I think, to get to 51% in an election. You don't have to win all white people. You don't have to win all affluent people. You do need a critical mass, though. And I think younger generations of whites are more open to difference, less fearful. If you look at Biden's coalition, it was powerful, right? And you have the Stacey Abrams of the world. You know, there are a lot of black women who are just saying, I'm gonna run now, you know? It's just time now. Let's just start running for office, right? So it's not about, I mean, yes, I would like to try through, you know, intellectual exercises like this and bell hooks to get the privileged white person to think about how their privilege has actually been created by society, right? But I'm more about, you know, organization, registering to vote, gathering power, you know. And if you don't do that work, you're just going to get more of the same, right? The systems, the structures of supremacy, once they're created, they just perpetuate themselves. And so every generation, this is, you know, it's just the truth, and I've had to come to terms with it, right? Every generation, particularly of black people, has to pick up the mantle and keep the resistance. It's, you know, you don't get to rest. And if you get tired, you have to hand it off to the next generation, right? That's just America, and you know, that's our struggle. And I'm afraid we're gonna keep this. I used to believe, I'll say this and then I'll stop talking so you can. I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, at the height of school integration, where this country was really trying to live up to Brown. You know, whites were still a little guilty, like, you know, we can do better than this, affirmative action. You know, basically came of age in the 70s, and I really thought that this was normal, like, you know, land of opportunity. I went to public school for 12 years, did really, really well, but the high school I graduated from became so impoverished they had to shut it down. And what I'm coming to realize is that actually what's normal for the US is this step forward and retrenchment, step forward and retrenchment, step forward. And you know, understanding that, it's better to understand it. This is Derek Bell's point. And deal with it and do your part for your generation and be really close to God, because you're gonna need it.
Absolutely. We have a question in our chat. What was the governor of Maryland, Hogan's, reaction to your insight to putting money into the highway system versus the minority neighborhoods?
Thank you. Thank you, whoever asked that question, right? The first chapter of the book, I use Baltimore as a case study for every era of these anti-black policies that I've been talking about. And everybody who's listening to me probably is quite familiar with what happened. Governor Hogan rescinded the red line that was going to connect the poorest neighborhoods of East and West Baltimore to job centers. And along that corridor, some of those neighborhoods, as much as 45% of the people are carless. And only 2% of the jobs in the city are in those neighborhoods. So if you want to have a job, you have to have transportation. And the only way you're going to have it is public transportation, right? He rescinded it, reallocated 100% of the money that had been earmarked for it to outlying majority white areas for road projects. Not one pothole in Baltimore was filled with that money. It was an outrage. He called it a wasteful boondoggle. But he supported the Purple Line, which is going to connect the most affluent suburbs of Washington, D.C. to our metro, right? And I wrote this up in Politico. This made me so angry, right? You know, and I don't even live in Baltimore, but this is immoral. Yes. And what happened after the Politico article came out, Sonny on The View read from it verbatim to Larry Hogan's face And he said, oh, well, that's not true. She said, oh, it's true. So in fact, his staff, when the piece came out, they called the Politico, my editors, to challenge him. And the Politico, and I'll say Reverend Robin, is responsible for me being a contributing editor at Politico. Thank you very much, sister. But they called up, and my editors stood by it because they said, there's nothing but truth here. There's nothing but truth here. It took a year of a Freedom of Information Act request.
Wow.
To unearth the truth that the LDF sued after this. They had concrete, objective evidence of a public policy that harmed black people and favored white people. For all to see in the numbers, and that's a violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, right? You're not supposed to use government funds to discriminate, right? And they filed a suit, and the Trump administration closed the investigation with no findings, right? So as a lawyer, this multi-degreed man, he's a law degree and so many other I was just outraged. So he didn't like it at all. And let me tell you, if that man runs for president, I am not going to be quiet about this. He is going to be held accountable.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out in the book.
And there's another question here, and I like it because it uses the word caste, and you even begin with truth. And the word that you use, caste, there's no sugarcoating about anything.
Right.
That is a word that is direct and to the point. A question from Sister Love says, how do you compare your writings with Isabel Wilkerson's book of the caste system?
Thank you so much for that question, sister. How do I compare what I say? I'm writing about residential caste, and the runaway bestseller Caste is more about social caste. And so, first of all, I use the word caste because it evokes the truth of intentional oppression, right? The two most persistent kinds of neighborhoods today are affluent, poverty-free spaces, which invariably are majority white, and high poverty black and brown neighborhoods, right? And those neighborhoods have persisted, and the barriers to them are getting harder, meaning it is harder to get into affluent space. Most people are excluded from them and can't afford, a multi-million-dollar home, and it is harder to get out of the hood. There is almost no social mobility. That is a caste system. And the biggest myth that we tell, and I shouldn't say we, society tells, is that high opportunity living is earned and hood living is the deserved result of so-called bad behavior, right? So I argue that it's a caste system, and I think my book puts more actual bones on the argument about caste, right? And I'll stop there. I hope I get some of her mojo, though.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another question from our chat room. Is there also an educational awareness component needed to show people how policies have impacted communities of color?
Is there an educational?
Well, I guess one way of also framing it is, what kind of educational awareness would you recommend to help people understand how these policies have impacted people of color?
Okay, so the self-serving answer is you could buy and read the book. I mean, honestly, I worked 4 years to create this. It's a labor of love.
Yes.
I thank you. I treasure every reader. But, I have evidence, thousands of endnotes. Everything I say is documented. You cannot deny there's truth there. And so, and I also try to give people a template for transformation, right? I don't, it's easy to critique what has been, but it's a lot harder to say, well, what should we do about it? And because, I worked in public policy in the White House, and I'm a bit of a policy wonk, I tried to give people concrete, both concepts and policies to pursue. So, in my ideal world, there'd be a lot of book clubs like this, where people are actually reading it and thinking about their own communities and what they look like, and deciding what policies they want to work on, right? But I give an example of education leading to transformation. Minneapolis has repealed its single-family zoning ordinance, which is truly radical in American society. Something like a very large number of cities in this country, it's illegal to build anything other than a detached single-family home on as much as 75% of the land. That's residential caste. We've ordered society only for a certain type of person who can afford that kind of living, right? And it took years of education in Minneapolis to change the political will around that. And academic and some civic organizations were just going to meeting with these maps and telling the story of how racial segregation was constructed in that society, in that city, and all of the inequality, right? So that's the kind of exercise you need, right? And that any city that you're concerned about with these issues, you can Google redlining and then name the city. And the map will pop up. And a lot of cities, and this is like Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, has stimulated a lot of this. A lot of cities are now excavating that history of segregation and redlining and educating themselves about it and citizens about it. And some of the cities that have had the most progress in getting better housing policies, more racial equity, have been going through that exercise of talking aloud with websites. It's a process. So, the book will help, but there are a lot of tools out there for expanding consciousness, I should say, right?
In your book, you also talk a lot about, going to your point earlier, about the ways in which stereotypes have been used by presidents, as well as policies that promote housing inequality. And you've raised some powerful examples, I'm sure surprising to some readers, as you talk about, we know about the examples you talk about with Reagan, Bush, but also you're also critical of some stereotypes and policies of President Clinton, Hillary Clinton, who ran for president. And interestingly, you talk about President Barack Obama, that in some ways that he did not use stereotypes or promote policies that supported housing inequality, but he did play on some tropes, right? And then you talk about Donald Trump, we know about him. But what's interesting here, you're most optimistic about Biden's win. You say it marks a major turning point in politics. And you say here on page 100, you say, in 2020, candidate Biden pointed to the 1994 crime bill's 10-year assault weapons ban, prohibitions on violence against women, and funding for drug treatment and background checks for gun purchases. Biden, historically a political moderate, also made racial reconciliation and racial justice a center tenet of his campaign. We reached a tipping point, it seemed, in Democratic politics. Right.
So it's so nice to talk to people who've actually read the book. You wouldn't believe the number of interviews I've done where it's clear they didn't even read the book. So thank you, you learned people.
You're welcome.
So let me just recap really quickly what you underscored in the lead up to your question. And this is my chapter on what I call ghetto mythology, right? the primary participants or purveyors of myths about descendants have been presidents and presidential aspirants. You know, from Richard Nixon, George Wallace, Law and Order, welfare queen, Reagan, Willie Horton, the first President Bush, to, you know, the Clintons with Super Predator. God bless them, I worked for them, right? To my classmate, I mean, I went to law school with both Michelle and Barack Obama. And you know, I'm an equal opportunity, just showing, right? And I'll say, but Barack Obama did not govern using these stereotypes, right? The Bushes and Reagan's the one who really started governing and having policies that were super harmful, animated by these stereotypes. Barack just would, when he was running, would often lecture to black audiences, often in a church while he's running. And I think he did that to make himself a little bit more palatable to white voters. You know, I really think that. But God bless him, he had some great policies. So I do think that we have reached a watershed in democratic politics. The Democratic Party's chief organizing principle in the South was white supremacy, you know, but that kind of dog whistling and coded rhetoric is a non-starter now if you want to win the Democratic coalition from the very far left to the moderates, right? And to have somebody campaigning for the presidency of the United States and the titular head who centered racial equity. I had never seen it in my lifetime. Never seen it in my lifetime. That was a watershed. And he got elected, and now he's bumping up against, you know, the backlash and the division and the structures sent against him, which includes gerrymandering, includes the Electoral College, it includes the, I'm mentally tired. What's the thing that in the debate in the Senate that keeps people from,
Filibuster?
The filibuster, right. So he won centering racial equity and racial justice. He has not been able to govern. And we'll see if he gets the social infrastructure package. But God bless him, he's trying, you know. But we have the other side.
We're getting more questions. And then for those of you who are here, if you have questions, just wave your hand. Or actually, and then we'll recognize you. Deacon Love, you wanted to pose a question? If you could come up to the mic so the people online can also hear your question, that'll be great.
Sheryll, you say that being
A little closer to the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
You say that being black in America is exhausting. Could you explain that?
I don't think I have to explain. I said it's in the introduction. Being black in America is exhausting. Do I need to explain that to anyone here? But I was writing that again. This book was in some ways decades in the making, but 3-4 years in the research. I was actually just writing up the chapters, and I went back and rewrote the introduction after everything was done. And this is like the summer of 2020. Weren't we all just exhausted? I mean, having Trump as president was exhausting. Getting up every day, hearing this nasty rhetoric, it just like killed your soul. And what really was so painful was that why is it so hard to reform a police system that's killing innocents? Like, why is that controversial, right? And I gave the example of on Memorial Day 2020, both George Floyd died and Christian Cooper got the police called on him the very same day. And it's like this convergence shows why it's just exhausting. And, you know, as a parent of, y'all know my beautiful boys, my fraternal twins, Logan and Langston. You know, they're past the cute stage now. They're almost 15. Logan's taller than both his parents now, right? They're almost 15, and it's started. They've had a couple of, not with police, but they have some friends who live out in Virginia, a multiracial family, and they've had a couple of instances where they're walking out in Fairfax and people stop in the car. What are y'all doing here? You know, so it started. And we've had to have the conversations, right? It's exhausting thinking about, you know, how do you raise black boys to love themselves and be confident, but not be too threatening, right? You know, it's like, that's exhausting.
Yeah.
Y'all know the answer to that question.
I have a couple more questions, and we're getting more questions online. We'll stop.
Thank you, people online. I love you.
So you have a cutoff point around?
No, I'm good.
Okay, we'll take about 10 or 15 more minutes. And Deacon Love also raised this question as well, but I was thinking about this as I was reading, is the way in which you weave together your family stories in this beautiful book. And you talk about lineage, those who came before you, and the sacrifices that they made. You talked earlier about the linkage between your family, Frederick Douglass. And I think about that in terms of this movement. Right before the pandemic, there's this great movement for genealogical research, right? People were trying to find out what parts of Africa, or whether we came from Africa, what our lineages were. But this is a very different kind of linkage to our lineage that you're talking about here. Is not for the sense of showing whether you're black or from Africa. That's important to know, right? But it's about this story that you're telling of struggle, of civil rights resistance, and how that animated and inspired you to do the work that you're doing. So can you share more about even this book? You talked about the pandemic and the struggles in our country for civil rights that you saw after George Floyd's killing, all of us saw. But also, how does that history, that genealogy, your ancestry, help to shape and animate your writing and the work that you're doing for justice?
Thank you for that beautiful question. So I wrote a memoir where I addressed this explicitly. It's called The Agitator's Daughter. But my great-grandfather was a Reconstruction legislator in Alabama, one of the first, not the first, but one of the first black lawyers in the state, right? And my father, who never met his grandfather, grew up hearing about him. His name was Sheryll V. Cashin. He grew up hearing about him and the greatness of black people during Reconstruction, when he was being inculcated in Jim Crow and being told by his white friends, it's now time for you to start calling me mister. And so it's like, wait a minute, black people can't vote, but they used to, like, my grandfather was actually in the legislature. You know, it was like, and so he took up the mantle and was determined to recreate what he heard about. And so he created an independent Democratic Party. That's right. At a time when the regular Democratic Party was dominated by George Wallace. Everybody's heard of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. A few people have heard of the National Democratic Party of Alabama. My father created it. He ran for governor against George Wallace, heading a ticket that got black people and liberal whites elected to county sheriff, you know, school board, all of these heavily black counties in West Alabama. Kick-started the second Reconstruction. So I grew up licking NDPA stamps and hearing about Grandpa Herschel and being part of the movement for black freedom in the state. My mother took me to a civil rights sit-in when I was 4 months old and got herself arrested, right? Now, Huntsville, Alabama, the police were not violent, so, but it was just all around me, their agitation, right? But in the book, this book, I used my own family's lineage to tell this story of continuum. Again, the enslaved leave the South, migrate north, and face housing discrimination. And I show like my great-great-grandmother, you know, ends up in Baltimore in the 1860s, and I just show this. She has Herschel V. Herschel V's a radical Republican. He's like, you know, on the scene with some of these other people. And then, you know, my family contends with housing segregation in Huntsville. You know, my father had to like get a white couple to buy a house in the high opportunity neighborhood so my brother could attend the only school that had resources for deaf children, right? So I'm like bringing in my own story, but all of you could have it, right? You know, every one of you will have some story of an ancestor. Oh, and you know, urban renewal. I didn't put it in the book, but the city of Huntsville took my father's dental office by eminent domain and put a parking lot there, right? To move the black people. So, but every one of you will have this story if you talk to people, right? You may have had, your grandfathers from home may have been taken by eminent domain to run the highway, right? I just tweeted this article in the Los Angeles Times about the trauma of black neighborhoods and highways, right? So I just used my family because it was convenient, but everybody's family has stories of what they had to deal with intentional black oppression. We're not unique. Although I must say, I think my father was unique in putting everything on the line, everything he had. You know, he was a dentist, and he was spending money out of his own pocket for this political party, right?
Wow. And you told many people's stories in the book. You told many people's stories. And
You
told many people's stories in the book. So
yeah. I wanted to lift up descendants and our stories of resistance.
There's a question or in a statement from Sister Deborah Crane Kemp. She said, one of my favorite quotes, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." Margaret Mead. And she goes on to ask, how do we apply real-time pressure to those in power to use the humane lens you speak about in your book?
Well, I really believe that the most powerful mobilization right now is probably going to be local, right? You could accomplish a lot more with Mayor Bowser's administration and getting what you want there than trying to get something through Congress. Not that we should give up on Congress, but in progressive-leaning, Democrat-run cities, you still have a lot of this over-investing in white neighborhoods, over-investing or under-investing in policies of care, particularly around schools, right? And so I think it's possible to have a grassroots coalition like the one I talked about in Milwaukee, you know, organize and demand from Democrats. Look, these neighborhoods are not getting their fair share.
That's right.
These apartheid schools should have the best teachers. You need some incentive pay. You know, pick your issue, right? It was interesting. Carl Racine wrote about, I didn't know about this, the horrible conditions in the DC jail. This is a Democrat-run city. We're supposed to be better than that, right? So I think that, and thank you for that question, whoever asked it. I think that, I'm losing my train of thought. I lost my train of thought, I'm sorry. But what my point is, whatever you care about, whatever your priority is, make it your business to know what grassroots multiracial organizations are doing the work of gathering power to transform policy now. You don't have to start from scratch. You know, I used to be part of this organization called Building One America, and they're fighting the Building One New Jersey chapter is fighting a huge battle around schools and school integration in that state, and they are organized, right? So there are a lot of organizations, a lot of faith-based ones. I think in DC, the Washington Interfaith Network, are you familiar with them, Pastor? WIN?
Yes.
Yeah.
WIN.
I mean, my understanding is that they were a big
clergy
force behind the inclusionary zoning ordinance we got, as weak as it is. So find out who's doing the transformative work or who's trying to build power on the issue you care about, and just join them, you know, and bring truth, bring data. Geographic maps tell stories really well. People get it when they see the map. Like, here's the map, and you know, and there's a lot of tools out there for that kind of work.
Also, you're getting certainly a lot of love in our chat room. Reverend James Crossan, great book discussion.
Thank you, Reverend Crossan. I love you.
And Deaconess Maddie Gay, indeed, this is a scholarly, well-written book. Professor Cashin. One question had to do with, is there an audio version of your book? And someone even answered, they just purchased an audio version of your book.
There's a beautiful audible version. I got to pick the actress. I got to pick the voice I liked, and I think I picked a very beautiful voice. I can't remember her name, but yes, you can buy it on Audible for $7.95.
and Deaconess Gay also says she plans to make purchases for Christmas gifts. So is it possible to leave some of the books here that people can purchase from the church, or how do you want to do that?
I mean, I'll sign the books and leave them here, but if I assume people would want personal messages, so maybe we can figure out how to do that. I can walk to the church. I live 10 minutes away. I'm on Upshur. I'm in Crestwood, right? So however you want to figure it out. I brought books here today, but I have a box at home. I don't know, maybe we give them my email, and if you want, should I just announce my email, or what?
Yeah,
how do you want to do this?
So people who purchase the book come to the church and purchase the book, or whatever.
Yeah, if they purchase the book, if they want to bring it to the church office with a note with who they want it signed to.
Sure.
You know, I can come sign them.
Okay.
I can come sign them. They can come back and pick it up, or they can email me directly. What do you think would be more efficient?
Let's just say that they could contact the church, and we'll give them instructions.
Okay, how about that? That's good.
So we give us a few moments to think that through, how we want to do that.
Contact the church, and they'll give you instructions, or we'll put it in the announcements or something.
Absolutely.
But I would love to do that for anyone who wants it.
Another question alongside the Bible. This is from Sister Sierra Tony. I read a black woman's memoirs as a source of strength. Is there a black woman's memoir, in addition to your own, that you would recommend that encourages you in this work?
Well, everybody should have read I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. Everybody should have read that.
Yes, indeed.
Toni Morrison hasn't written a memoir, but I am so moved by her work. She's really one of my favorites. But they asked for memoirs, so I'll leave it with Maya Angelou.
Maya Angelou. Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
I think
There's another question also.
Young.
Do you have any thoughts on the ways in which residential caste is affecting people's access to health care and Social Security benefits?
So residential caste affects black people's access to everything, particularly if you're in high poverty neighborhoods. But, you know, if you're in a high poverty neighborhood, everything is disparate. Typically, your access, and we saw this with COVID, right? You know, COVID was able to disproportionately kill black and brown people, particularly in poor areas. So there's less health care, there's less jobs, there's less healthy food. right? Believe it or not, post-COVID, the difference in life expectancy between the poorest and the richest neighborhoods of DC is 27 years. 27 years. In the hood in the United States, the life expectancy is closer to Rwanda, right? So it's everything, but including healthcare.
There's one of our members is also an educator, and she shared that certainly she's concerned about the education of our children in the hood or in our community. You also shared in the book your challenges as someone who is a Washingtonian trying to get one of your sons in it's a public charter school. I'm not sure, I don't want to say the name.
Both of my sons.
Both of your sons in public charter schools, and just the challenges that you have with trying to provide your own children with a quality education, living here in Northwest DC. And so what from your own experiences, and how would you speak to the frustration of this educator who's just really concerned about the challenges our own children in the hood are having around getting a quality education?
You know, I have an entire chapter on schools, and she knows, and everybody knows, that there are savage inequalities, right? The average existence for a black child in public education today is one where most of their peers are minority and at least half of their peers are poor. And there are many elementary schools in this city, far too many, that are nearly all black and nearly all poor. You can call them apartheid schools if you like. And there's nothing inherently wrong with being poor. Well, poverty itself is a problem, but what's immoral in this society is through our policies we've constructed concentrated poverty. We don't do the hard work of changing boundary lines to disrupt it. I cite the example on Capitol Hill. You can find an apartheid school and a majority white low poverty school within 1 mile of each other, right? And invariably, the higher the poverty school, the less experienced the teachers, and in that environment, they need and deserve more. They need smaller class sizes with excellent teachers, right? The LeBron James School shows that you can create excellence in that environment, but it costs a lot more, and you need to dramatically reduce the adult to student ratio to almost 1 adult to all 4 children. But we're not willing to spend money to give that kind of infusion that's necessary in high poverty environments. We're also not willing to change the boundaries to create more racial and socioeconomic education. So what do black people like myself who actually have money and have choice do? It puts you in this dilemma, and I was quite honest about it, right? We bypassed our neighborhood school. We were going to give it a shot, but we managed to get into the Washington U. Ying School, the #1 public charter school in the city, through a lottery. Right? And we also had the sophistication to negotiate the lottery. We got in on our 3rd try. Right? So Langston and Logan speak, read, and write Mandarin, because of this excellent school. They're on an IB track, right? And we stayed, we went from Washington U. Ying to DCI, and so we got 7 years of very good public education, and we stayed in it as long as it was working, And DCI is a wonderful school, I'll say, but by 7th grade, 53% of the kids were on free and reduced lunch, right? We were walking the walk, right? And I'll say, and I say it with love, some of those kids were bringing their social pain and disruption to school, right? it's painful to talk about this.
Yeah.
But, you know, disruption, by 7th grade, some kids are figuring out that they got a lot more power than they realize, right? They're less compliant, then they start to exercise it, right? And so there was more disruption and a lot of substitute teachers and less consistency. They had some fabulous teachers, but that plus the pandemic, it just wasn't working as much for my kids. And so I did what a parent should do. You know, I looked for better options, and they won a scholarship to a new independent school, right? But it's really, really hard, right? Where do you live if you're a black person who has choices, right? According to Raj Chetty, an economist at Harvard, who's done a lot of study about children and social mobility, the best neighborhoods for black boys are ones where there are a lot of black fathers around, and there's very little racial prejudice in the white people that are around. Think about that. So we had the money and considered going west of the park to get into some of these really, really excellent public schools, right? But we would have been like the only black people there, and I'm not, you know, so we chose to stay in Shepherd Park, and then we moved to Crestwood, right? I do think in both of those neighborhoods, there are a lot of two-parent black families, a lot of black fathers around, and a lot of Black Lives Matter signs among the neighbors. It's tough. What are the right choices for your kids? And let alone not my kids, what I really shine a light on is we are not serving poor black children well. We are not. So what I feel like is all I can do is shine a light on it and say this is immoral, and we need to keep fighting the fight of integration, and in the meantime, more racial equity.
Amen. I want to thank you for an amazing discussion and an amazing book, White Space, Blackhood, Opportunity, Hoarding, and Segregation in an Age of Inequality. Our very own church member, scholar extraordinaire, Sister Sheryll Cashin. We thank you so much, and we're so excited. And we're graced and thankful that you decided to spend this time with us today to talk about your work, its implications, and what we can do to help join this movement to fight inequality. And I want to also thank Sister Rakia Flagg-Bonner for my co-facilitator. Thank you so much. Thank Deacon Love for your work in helping to be our moderator, to set the table for our discussion today, especially for your book review and our online epistle. And we want to thank our media and technology ministry for their work behind the scenes to help make this possible. Our office staff and those who are working behind the scenes, our EMT. We want to thank all of you, our members of 19th Street Baptist Church, for your comments and questions in our chat room on our YouTube page. Thank you so much. And you're certainly getting a lot of high praise from your church family online for a great discussion.
Thank you so much, church family. I love every last one of you. Writing is a lonely business, so I just feel so lifted up by all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. And also stay tuned. You'll hear more information about our next Pastor's Book Club as we continue to bring to you great authors who are doing great work. Thank you so much for joining us today, and God bless.
Amen.